medical gaslighting. Why am I talking about this? Is it really hurting women? Stick around. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Just the Tip with Dr. Vic / Sex Nerd Podcast. My name is Dr. Victoria Hartman, and I realize I haven't done an episode in, quite some time. I've been trying to set up a new podcast studio with some upgraded equipment, and I've had just one hell of a time. I'm about halfway there. As some of you probably figured out, I'm primarily recording on Zoom. I have, however, downloaded OBS, and I'm sort of trying to learn the ropes on OBS, including like the filters and the right cameras to use and so forth. I really actually like the OBS platform. I just, I'm kind of new to the game on that. But today I wanted to actually talk about a subject matter that has become an issue in the adult film industry, and it resonated with me because of my own experiences with, especially working with the gynecological medical community. So let's start from the beginning. Now, this is going to be more of a commentary video. I generally don't discuss matters of a personal nature too much, but I felt that in this particular case, it was relevant. And it resonated with me because of the particular nature of what's going on in the adult industry, in particular, women's sexual health, folks with uteruses, and how they are struggling with an infection in the industry that, in fact, is not unique to it. So it's not because it's the adult industry that this has become a problem. This has been a problem for a long time. It's just now the industry is starting to feel the effects of it. So what's been reported in the industry recently is a change in the testing protocols. Now, some of you who might be familiar with the adult industry know that they test for the standard STIs about every 2 weeks, roughly every 2 weeks. Without a current test that's less than 2 weeks, 2 weeks old or less, you can't work. And not all sets require condoms. So for especially the condomless sets, these 2 week testing protocols are very important. And it's been largely successful in the industry of these testing protocols. If I remember right, there hasn't been an HIV infection in over a decade. So, but what we're seeing, especially on the Twitterverse, is a lot of the female talent complaining about reoccurring Mgen infections. Now, what exactly is Mgen? Now, Mgen is short for Mycoplasma genitalium, which is a sexually transmitted infection. It's a small pathogenic bacterium that lives on the mucous epithelial cells of the urinary and genital tracts in humans. Medical reports published in 2007 and 2015 state that Mgen is becoming increasingly common. Now, I'm going to actually share something rather personal about my experience, not with Mgen, but a bacteria from the same class known as Mycoplasma hominis, as well as Uroplasia. Now, what are some of the symptoms of Mgen? Because a lot of people haven't heard of Mgen. They're vaginal discharge, pain in the lower abdomen, abnormal vaginal bleeding, so intramenstrual bleeding, bleeding after sex. It has also been linked to PID, which is pelvic inflammatory disease, which can cause infertility, preterm births, and spontaneous abortions. Others of this genome, the Mycoplasma genome, cause the same. This has not been an STD that the industry has tested for. They've tested for the standard STIs, chlamydia, gonorrhea, HIV, syphilis, etc. But Mgen, not so much. Now, where my personal experience comes in, well, let me backtrack. So what we're seeing, a lot of conversation is happening on Twitter, at least that I've noticed amongst talent, who's talking about reoccurring infections and how some have had to actually leave the industry because of extreme PID, scar tissue, sometimes having to have a hysterectomy. Also, since it wasn't tested for until recently, people were either infected and didn't know it and were transmitting it to others in the industry, or they were being misdiagnosed and given the wrong antibiotics, or their symptoms were dismissed. And this is where medical gaslighting comes in. And there have been quite a few reports. Now, of course, this is anecdotal, obviously. This is just what I've observed from performers who have said, my doctors are not taking my symptoms seriously. They're saying, well, this doesn't really cause that many problems, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, actually it does. It can cause long-term harm, or it can cause infertility. But I think, at least from what I can gather from what I'm reading, a lot of the talent who, now this can infect anyone. It doesn't just obviously infect people with uteruses. It infects anyone. It's transmitted sexually. So it doesn't matter what genitals you have, you can transmit it. However, people with uteruses usually notice the symptoms if they have them. Now, the reason this really resonates with me, these complaints about being gaslit by the gynecological medical community is, well, first of all, we already know the stigma against sex workers. So that's a given, okay? The medical community is not going to take sex workers seriously. And I think if you ask just about any sex worker, if they're lucky to find a physician, especially a gynecological physician that takes them seriously, that's a rare occurrence, because for the most part, when you're a sex worker, there's this sort of underlying attitude that, well, you put yourself in this position given the work that you do. And I've done several episodes on that kind of stigma. I'm not going to rehash it here, but you can tell from my facial expression, it irritates me greatly. Now, you can also, this isn't just sex workers. It's not just people in the adult industry. This affects everybody. And I can show you that just simply by, let's go to what we're seeing on the screen right now, okay? There are countless stories on the internet about medical gaslighting of all kinds of like major news outlets, standard channels on TV. I think Today's Show did a story on medical gaslighting, and this doesn't just affect people who are trying to get gynecological care, but all kinds of stuff, cancer, obstetrics. It just keeps going on and on and on. And according to some of the stats that are out there, the people that are affected most are women and people of color. And what I often see is medical gaslighting around gynecology. So we have that now as a primer to this, my experience, and I'm really glad that the folks put these kinds of their experiences on the internet, because it really helps to make you not feel so alone. And don't get me wrong, not all doctors are going to dismiss you. It just seems like, especially where gynecology is concerned, those that are going to take you seriously are quite rare and nonchalant about symptoms of gynecological problems. So with some trepidation, I'll get into my story and add to the voices that are talking about this phenomenon, especially the same kind of thing, the sex workers. It's not just sex workers that are experiencing it, as anyone. So I will now share my story. So roughly in my mid-30s, I started experiencing what can only be described as an increasing levels of excruciating pain around a week before my menstrual cycle. And then during my menstrual cycle, I was just about completely incapacitated. I couldn't work. I couldn't function. I had severe GI issues. I was in the hospital on some occasions from the pain. And it was 2 weeks a month because of it's build up premenstrually, and then the first 3-4 days, the first 3 or 4 days of my menstrual cycle, and then it would abate for another couple of weeks, and then it would start all over again. It got to the point where I was taking so much ibuprofen that I gave myself a stomach bleed and had to stop taking ibuprofen and switch to Tylenol. But of course, you can't take a lot of Tylenol because, of the side effects on your liver. So this situation that I was in went on for 21 years. 21. When I look back on it now, I marvel that I didn't go, or maybe I did, that I didn't absolutely lose my shit over it. I had, in that 21 years, now mind you, I did that for every 2 weeks, or 2 weeks a month, for 21 years. Try and hold down a job dealing with that for 21 years, 2 weeks out of the month. Now, it has a medical name. It's called dysmenorrhea, and that means painful periods. But that's a very sort of clinical way of saying agony on a level that you can't. This was birthing pain level pain, only it lasted 2 weeks a month for 21 years. Now, you might ask yourself, well, why 21 years? Didn't you go to the doctor? Yeah, 17 doctors, 17 gynecologists, everyone from gynecological surgeons to reproductive cancer doctors. I went to doctor after doctor, and in 2 different states. In 2 different states, I went to doctor after doctor after doctor after doctor. Some said, well, gosh, well, we should do exploratory surgery. And if we find something, we can remove it. Or if we find, let's say you have an excessive amount of endometriosis, we'll just do a hysterectomy. Some doctors actually said I was crazy, that I was making a big deal out of nothing. Women have periods and sometimes they hurt. Get over it. Here's a Tylenol. I also, during pap smears, had severe sensitivity to where sometimes I would jump when they would, do the pap test. Same thing. It's not that bad. You can't possibly. One example stood out and still stands out in my mind to this day. This is where this medical, not only the medical gaslighting that comes into play, but the sexism that comes into play with some gynecologists. Not all, but some. Now, mind you, these are people who go to school for 8 to 12 years to help women and people with uteruses manage their reproductive and sexual health. That's their job. They spent $200,000 or $300,000 to go to school for that job. Okay. Here's a great example. I still, when I think about it, I can't actually believe that this actually happened. This was the 16th doctor. I was there with my partner at the time, who had witnessed me being in this state for a few years at that point. This was a new doctor, so I explained the situation to him as calmly as I could, but obviously after 20 some odd years, well, I think at that point it was 20 years of suffering to that degree. You got to remember, I couldn't plan flights. I couldn't plan trips. I didn't know if I'd be able to work or not. If my children had an event going on. Well, maybe mom can show up and maybe mom can't, because she might be on the floor sick or in bed sick or what have you. So I explained the situation to this doctor. And like I said, my partner at the time was sitting next to me. And I begged him for some kind of solution. And at that point, I was ready to have a hysterectomy. And what was interesting, and I had been ready for that for a long time. And the doctors that I saw, now, when I finally found the doctor that cured me, I was 47 years old. Up until I was 47 years old, 47 years old, I had doctors telling me, well, hysterectomy is a last resort because you might still want to have children. I hadn't wanted to have children since my 20s. Or they said, well, you might meet someone someday that wants to have children. They were still saying this to me in my 40s, as if this choice wasn't mine. It was, I couldn't make this choice on my own, or maybe I wasn't making the right choice, or gosh, I should just wait until someone else decides they want to have children with me. It's not really up to me anyway. It's up to whoever I end up partnering with. Okay. Coming back to that, I told the doctor what was going on and that I wanted a hysterectomy, because at this point I didn't know what the solution was. That doctor turned to my male partner at the time, kind of did one of these side grins and said, is it really that bad? The partner I had at the time looked at the doctor, and I knew that look when he was pissed. And he looked at that doctor and he said, did you just ask me whether or not my partner was telling you the truth about the suffering she's dealing with? This woman that I have watched writhe on the floor in agony, in screaming agony, you're asking me if she's telling the truth? So I'm paraphrasing there. It's something along those lines. And when we left, and the doctor immediately was like, oh, okay, we'll schedule you for, now mind you, he had not offered any kind of testing or anything. He was like, okay, we'll schedule you for a hysterectomy. Only after my male partner got upset with him. And when we walked out, that partner that I had at the time said, you know what? I don't know I would have believed it if I hadn't just experienced this myself. And he said, I have been told by previous partners and lovers that this happens. And there was always a part of me that was like, he's like, and I regret ever, even for a second, being skeptical about that. I literally just saw it happen. I switched doctors again. There was no way I was going to let that doctor touch me, especially for a reproductive surgery. Nope. There's no way I was going to let that doctor. Now, it's not exclusive to male doctors. I have had some of the worst female gynecologists who were brutal and insensitive. And, you know, one of the ones that called me crazy was a female gynecologist. It's just a period. Get over it. And this was a cancer specialist. God only knows how horrible her bedside manner really is. So I then went to the 17th doctor. And the other part that people often don't want to discuss, especially around gynecology, is how uncomfortable gynecologists are talking to you about sex. And I know that from personal experience, not just like my own experience dealing with gynecologists, but I've had several, when I was in private practice, I had several gynecologists refer their patients to me for their sexual issues. Gynecologists. Okay, that's fine. So this doctor, however, was also a trained sexologist. On top of being a gynecologist and a fertility specialist, was also a trained sexologist. thank God. I told the same tale of woe that I wanted a solution for, and that I just haven't. And he said, okay, before we make any, he's like, if you want a hysterectomy, you know, and that's the solution to the problem, we'll make that happen. However, let me ask you some questions. And proceeded to ask me questions that no other doctor in 21 years and 16 sexual health physicians, gynecologists, hadn't asked me. Not one. He said, these questions might be personal, but they're important so that I can understand what's going on. Okay, sure. He said, in the last 21 years that you've been dealing with this, how many partners have you had unprotected sex with? I was like, 4. Okay. How many of them had a vasectomy? 1. He's like, okay, so you've had unprotected sex with 3 partners over the course of 21 years. Yes, including the one sitting here with me. Okay. Of those 3, with how many, with whom did you have a pregnancy scare in those 21 years? And I'm like, 0. He's like, you've never had a pregnancy or even a miscarriage in those 21 years? No. So effectively, you've been infertile. Okay, yeah. And none of your other physicians asked you why you had been infertile during your most fertile years. I'm like, nope. Because you remember, I started having these symptoms late 20s, early 30s, and well into my, okay. So your most fertile years, not one doctor has asked you if you've had a pregnancy scare or a pregnancy or a miscarriage. No. And the reason that he asked me about how many was sometimes infertility can be the result of poor motility in sperm. So if I had only been with one partner, that then might be something to look into, low motility, low sperm motility. But since I had 3, well, it's unlikely that you're going to have 3 partners with low sperm motility. I mean, I suppose it's possible, but it's unlikely. If I'd only had 1, that would be something to look into. And he said, okay, I'm going to run some tests and then I'll let you know. I think I know what's going on here, but I'll let you know. Okay. And I got a call, I suppose 3, 4, 5 days later. I want you to come in with your partner and let's go over your results. So I went in and he said, well, yeah, one of the things that, we look for as fertility doctors is things that might cause infertility. And considering that you've been at your reproductive peak and not had a pregnancy in spite of having years where there was always the potential for you to be pregnant or fall pregnant, you tested positive for M. hominis and uroplasia. And now as a sexologist, I looked at him and said, what's that? I'd never heard of that in school. I'd never heard that from any of the 16 doctors. Nothing. Not in the STI education materials, nothing. M. hominis being, of course, Mycoplasma hominis, which is in that Mycoplasma genome. Said, well, when you are dealing with a situation where there's infertility, you look for causes. And since you had not ever gotten pregnant during your most, the height of your reproductive years, he's like, this is an incredibly common bacteria that causes these things, causes infertility and PID and all the symptoms that you're talking about. So I'm going to prescribe you an antibiotic for 2 weeks, you and your partner, with doxycycline. And let's see how you do after the 2 weeks. This was the 17th doctor in 21 years who finally had said, I think I may have took the antibiotics for 2 weeks. And I was cured. And all of a sudden, I got my life back. And I was super pissed off. Those simple questions that doctor asked me in order to determine, to at least guide his path. He wasn't proposing invasive surgery. He's like, now most gynecologists aren't going to ask you those questions because they're too embarrassed. Having said that, not all, but most. Just because they're reproductive doctors doesn't mean they have an easy time talking about sexual things. All of a sudden, I had my life back after 21 years and 16 doctors. When I look back on that now, I mean, this was like 10 years ago now. And I think how much time I lost because the gynecological medical community either tried to gaslight me or just was so embarrassed that they couldn't ask the right questions. I don't want to get down on the gynecological medical community as a general rule because they serve an important function in all kinds of different ways, bringing healthy babies into the world, etc. But there's so much that could still be done to validate a patient's experience, especially when it comes to pain, and to ask basic questions, basic sexual health questions in order to determine that perhaps it's not requiring major surgery. Maybe it's something as not as little as, but maybe it's a treatable thing without a lot of trauma that goes along with treatment. Now, gynecology is not the only industry, the medical industry that's guilty of this. I'm just focusing on it right now because of what's going on in the adult industry. Now they're finally making the Mgen test a standard test, which I think is wonderful because the problem is people are getting misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed or undertreated or mistreated, they're not getting the proper treatment and it's becoming antibiotic resistant. And I've read some of the statements from some of the people in the industry that they've not only had to retire from the industry, but ended up in their 20s having to get hysterectomies because they weren't diagnosed properly. And the scar tissue was so severe and so painful that they had to actually have a hysterectomy. Now, this is a common problem. And this is what this doctor said. He said, well, this is a common, this is a bacteria that causes infertility. So if you're a fertility specialist, you look for it. So this is not a new thing. Mgen might be an evolution of the Mycoplasma genome, but if I do the math right, I ended up starting dealing with M. hominis in the 90s. What's important when you're dealing with a client or a patient is to listen. They know their bodies, they know their minds, and to guide based on the information that you have. It's also important especially as a medical doctor, it's to not only ask the right questions, but not be afraid to ask the questions. Because if this doctor had not asked me about my sexual history, I might have continued to suffer. Now, that's not the first incident of that kind of thing that I've been through. I've actually been through that 3 times with other things. Where doctors were like, oh, no, that doesn't cause pain. I don't know what that, no, it actually did. And another doctor would say, oh, absolutely, this causes extreme levels of pain. I'm not sure why your other doctor said that. So this video not only was meant to address the kind of gaslighting that goes on, the kind of dismissal and invalidation that goes on in the medical community, but especially, given I'm a sexologist and a sex educator, to educate the public on mycoplasma, uroplasia, the Mgen, all these families of bacteria, because this is not just relegated to the sex worker community. This causes widespread infertility and pelvic inflammatory disease. And doctors need to take patients' complaints about pain in this area more seriously and ask simple questions, whether they struggle with them or not. If you are a sexual health provider, if you are a gynecologist or work with gynecology, I'm not going to address urology because I'm not as educated on urology as I am in gynecology, or women's sexual health, I should say. Ask the questions. If you're a medical practitioner in gynecology, ask the questions, or send your patient to someone who's not afraid to ask the questions. I don't care. Or maybe as a gynecological healthcare provider, have a sexologist on staff who will ask these questions that you are too uncomfortable to ask, because you could spare your patient decades of suffering. I'm starting to get angry when I think about this and all the time I wasted. All the time that was wasted for me. I didn't waste time. I spent 21 years trying to find a solution and was repeatedly dismissed and had doors closed in my face. 21 years I lost. I lost 21 years. Now, if I had wanted to have more children, I would probably be doubly pissed off. But that's neither here nor there. I am really glad that the adult industry is advocating for its workers and that they are adding this test or have added this test to their panel of testing protocols, or to their testing protocols, I should say, the STI panels that they do now. I am really glad. There are others out there that people don't talk about. There are sexual strep infections. Some of the strep strains can cause STIs, or can be transmitted and can cause, not always. There are plenty that aren't sexually transmittable. However, please take the example from the adult industry, gynecologists, and ask your patients if they come in with pelvic pain, just do a bacteria test. Check for all of the bacteria. Okay. This isn't the cause. This should never be the cause for stigma against any particular group of people having an STI. It just shouldn't. And not all of these infections are sexually transmitted. And even if they are, I don't care. Don't just test for chlamydia. Don't just test for gonorrhea. They default to gonorrhea and chlamydia. Check for Mgen. Check for M. hominis. Check for uroplasia. Check for strep infections. Not just oral, but genital as well. Check for these things. Someone's coming in with pain, and don't just dismiss them as it's just a period. Women have had periods for millennia. Could you just be, if you're going to be a sexual health provider, medical provider, could you just be a little bit better at listening and be a little bit more curious? Could you try and do that? So stories like mine don't have to happen anymore, or worse. That would be great. All right, with that, I'm going to wrap up. I'm still, like I said, I do plan on transitioning completely over to OBS and upgrading my camera equipment. It's just a process, and I'm being pulled in a bunch of different directions. But hopefully the quality and, the bells and whistles will be what I want them to be. I actually really like the OBS UI. So I'm still learning it and so forth. But hopefully I'll have all that set up with my next video, and then we can actually have a lot of fun. So with that, I will leave you today. Oh, that actually reminds me. So over the course of the last 9 months, 10 months, I have been working with the most amazing musician. I could go on and sing his accolades. And he gave me the incredible privilege. Some of you know I have a background in the film industry before I got into academics. He gave me the incredible privilege of being the creator of his first music video that he's ever released. And you can see that music video. It takes you over to his channel, his music channel, in the section called music videos on my page on my channel. And it's called Real Horror Story. And I had a lot of fun with it. You know, it was great to do something a little different than just like filmmaking. I mean, this was filmmaking, but yet not, because I was putting a bunch of elements together. And this time it was centered around music, and I tried to tell a story around music. Anyway, I could go on and on about this artist, but all you have to do is scroll down to the music video section. I might be doing more. Actually, I have been doing more. I'm working on 4 other ones, three or 4 other ones, 3 or 4 other of his songs. So hopefully I will make more videos that make him proud, and also that the audience to my channel will enjoy them as well. It's just a little side project that I have a good time with, but I will hopefully have OBS set up and will be podcasting more regularly in the near future. So with that, thank you so much for joining me on Sex Nerd Podcast, Just a Tip with Dr. Vic. And I will see you next time. Bye.